So thank you, Lucas, and thank you, Jason and Lavelle, for organizing this really wonderful symposium and having us here. And thank you also, Aaron, for advocating for the importance of the humanities in thinking about STEM fields and in science fiction. So, as Lucas mentioned, working on a book that I talked about last year at the Symposium on happiness and Utopian Studies, but this year I'm going to actually address the theme of interdisciplinarity by returning to a project that I started about a decade ago and sort of put on the back burner, but now I'm returning to in earnest as sort of the makings, I hope, of what might be my second book. It's tentatively titled Composing Resistance, Writing and Revision in Dystopian Texts. And the study bridges writing studies, literary analysis, utopian studies, science fiction, and social justice in the real world. Performing close reading and conversation with composition, rhetorical, and utopian theories, I demonstrate how protagonists in a variety of dystopian texts rebel rhetorically and narratively through their experiences in composing. And the project also argues that these characters' composing strategies are integral to developing individual consciousness raising and social and structural change. The acts of writing, revision, reflection, and reading bring agency to otherwise powerless citizens in dystopian regimes through the freedom to choose language and words, to restructure events or reality, to express emotions, and most importantly, to imagine alternatives and other possibilities to the current situation. By undermining the legitimacy of the dystopian hierarchies that oppress them and replacing this control within their self-created narratives, these characters introduce new values, ideologies, and hopes to these otherwise bleak and totalizing worlds. So also, I really appreciate your listening to me. This project is kind of in the nascent stages, so any feedback later or after is really welcome. At the core of this project is the claim that writing studies, with its nuanced understanding of the composition and revision process, opens up new opportunities for engaging with speculative text and science fiction as a genre. For example, writing studies can help us to make sense of the various genres of writing that characters undertake in science fiction texts. Sometimes the writing is transactional, serving as state propaganda and reproducing dominant ways of being. Sometimes it's archival, helping to document marginal embodied ways of living, showing that the world once was different and that it might be so again. Sometimes the writing is personal, expressive, and therapeutic, providing an outlet for emotions, fears, and desires in a repressed state. Sometimes the writing is metacognitive, allowing critical reflection on the writing process itself, and so the composing acts become a type of literacy narratives in worlds that relentlessly destroy language, history, records, and the past. Sometimes the writing allows connection with others by allowing dialogue with an audience, real or imagined, and by valuing meaningful communication in societies that often prohibit intimacy at all costs. In all cases, experiments in composing extend from the individual to the larger society, allowing the characters to approach their own worlds rhetorically, imaginatively, creatively, and critically, and to see their worlds as texts, things that can be reflected on, rethought, and revised. And perhaps most significantly, writing studies highlights the act of composition as generative. Writing itself is creative and speculative. It is a utopian act that can allow alternative possibilities to emerge and be considered through recursive acts of composition. And so in this way, I'm arguing composition, the act of writing and creating new worlds through text, is literally an act of world building and extrapolation, which are, of course, defining features of the science fiction genre. I also just want to say that in addition to analyzing science fiction and utopian and dystopian text through the lens of writing studies, I'm hoping that composing resistance can also employ the concepts and methods of utopian studies to conceptualize and approach common composition and rhetorical problems in new ways. So just to take one example, I'm not really going to talk about that today, but just to give you a sense, an important aspect of writing is, of course, knowing one's audience and communicating effectively to them, and challenges arise when a writer doesn't have a clear sense of her readers' values or how they might respond. In dystopian narratives, this problem reaches a crisis point, as there is often either no one like-minded who shares the same values, or in post-apocalyptic scenarios, there is literally no one left with whom to communicate. The protagonists who write in these extreme circumstances offer new perspectives on how to communicate across these gaps. So, in talking about these gaps, one of the most important aspects of the speculative genre is they help us to imagine other possibilities, but they also allow us to critically reflect on the world the way it is. And in doing so, they allow us to see spaces where maybe there needs to be transformations. So in Utopian Studies, we often talk a lot about this gap between the way the world is and the way it ought to be. And I see my work, not only in this project, but sort of the larger work, as helping to bridge that gap. And I do see writing and composing as an activity that actually sort of creates a bridge across the world the way it is and the world the way it might be. But the reciprocal relationship between writing and speculative fiction is rarely addressed in the scholarship of either field. Even a cursory glance at the genre, however, shows that dystopian text, science fiction text, almost always explicitly or indirectly address the act of writing itself. Sometimes this happens through form and stylistic things. So often dystopian text, science fiction texts are written in the form of journals or diary entries, as epistolary in the form of letters, or sometimes it happens in the content or the plot where a character may undergo the act of writing, often in secret because it's prohibited. Today I'm going to just briefly give you 4 examples, some of more notable and recognizable examples, which just offer a snapshot of the complex landscape of composition possibilities in this text. So to begin with, just briefly, I'll start with George Orwell's 1984, because it's probably a communal frame of reference, published in 1949. And this is a text that is, even though it is about the erasure of history and it's about the suppression of language and literacy, as most dystopian texts are, it actually is suffused with meditations on language, on literacy, on writing, acts of composition and acts of reading. Of course, we have Winston's diary. The book opens with Winston beginning a diary, which within its, in and of itself is a heretical act. But the novel also has different acts of composition and acts of reading that composition, so reader reception as well. For instance, Winston, the main character, his job is to literally rewrite history, right? His job in the miniature or the Ministry of Truth, where his job actually involves imaginative composition acts. He needs to recreate reality according to another standard. So he is literally a compositionist. There's also an example of other texts that are introduced. So there's the book, Ray Goldstein's book, which is introduced as a text that then he reads. There's also the appendix, which kind of complicates the novel by being another act of composition that is in dialogue with the text. So I'm not going to go into detail about this novel, but just to kind of give you an example of the multi-layered writing projects that happen within a dystopian text. I'm going to talk a little bit more detail in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, published in 1985, but which has recently received a lot of renewed interest thanks to its adaptation in a Hulu series, and also thanks to our current political climate. So in The Handmaid's Tale, if you're familiar with it, women are forced to be civic prostitutes, and they're unwillingly charged with the repopulation of Gilead's dwindling race, and they are characterized as, quote, two-legged wombs that's all sacred vessels, ambulatory chalices. Denied individual voices, identities, and names, handmaids seem wholly without agency. Excuse me. However, Offred, our narrator, is eager to create with more than her womb. She composes a story as a means of structuring her experiences, regaining control, providing an antidote to her passive lifestyle, and coping with Gilead's harsh realities. She consciously creates and composes a subjective, non-linear tale filled with flashbacks, speculation, memories, and hopes. And by blending genre, thank you, she merges fiction and fact and constructs a hybrid text that approximates her own schizophrenic experiences as a handmaid in Gilead. She says, quote, "This contradictory way of believing seems to me right now the only way I can believe anything. Whatever the truth is, I will be ready for it." She repeatedly and relentlessly points to the reconstructed nature of her narrative, intuiting that, quote, "It's impossible to say a thing exactly the way it was. You always have to leave something out. There are too many parts, sides, cross-currents, nuances." Sensitive to the dictum that context is all, her recursive revisionist view of the world proves more flexible than the exclusionary male-dominated ideology that reigns in Gilead. And actually, this text also, like 1984, is complicated by another text at the end, in this case the historical notes, which is an affixed transcription of a symposium, much like us, occurring 2 centuries after Offred's story unfolds. and which declares in an objective, self-assured tone that sharply contrasts with the preceding narrative's self-conscious instability, that Offred's manuscript, her composition, is now the product of two male scholars' rigorous, quote, transcription, annotation, and publication. So as professional readers and writers, these male professors had to fuse the gaps in her text in order to reach, quote, a decision as to the nature of the material. And they're continually frustrated by the paucity of more important verifiable details of Gilead. So this is actually a really interesting case where you have competing narrative and writing projects in the same text, and where they're, by looking at them, they're sort of struggling for control. But I want to spend most of my time today thinking about an earlier text, Evgeny Zamyatin's dystopian text, We, originally published in 1921, that also foregrounds the act of writing. The novel consists of 40 journal entries describing the one state, a society that has proudly solved the mathematical equation of happiness, eliminating free will, and instead quantifying all of life's activities. And I should add, excising the imagination taboo. On the very first page of We, the narrator, D503, who is a perfect servant of the state, outlines his writing project by literally reproducing verbatim the propaganda of the one state and its call to praise the society. So actually, his composing project is in response to the one state asking people to produce kind of praise in terms of it. So he imagines his narrative from the outset to be, like the equation and rule of the one state, a, quote, great, divine, exact, wise, straight line, end quote. He structures his journal entries with topic headings that outline and reinforce a state-mandated agenda, and is concerned at first only with accuracy, wanting to be a vessel through which the glory of the one state can be recorded and passed on. And he literally is unable to conceive in his composition of alternative possibilities for experiencing the world or for capturing these experiences in words. He continues, quote, I shall merely attempt to record what I see and think, or, to be more exact, what we think. Precisely so, we, and let this we be the title of my record, end quote. Just as Offred's mission is to mechanically conceive a child so that it then may be turned over to the Republic of Gilead, D503's task is to unthinkingly create this narrative so that it may ultimately serve the state in their attempts at colonization. He asserts, quote, I write this and my cheeks are burning. This must be similar to what a woman feels when she first senses within her the pulse of a new, still tiny, still blind little human being. It is I, and at the same time not I, and for many long months it will be necessary to nourish it with my own life, my own blood, then tear it painfully from myself and lay it at the feet of the one state. So G503 in this moment is conceptualizing this writing project as serving the state, but also kind of being a blend of his own experiences, which of course are completely aligned with the state. But before long, there's an undeniable shift in D503's narrative. His journal, the state-mandated cargo for colonization, transforms into a diary about love, about subjectivity, about a soul, and most importantly, about free will. The purpose and trajectory of his narrative project has changed, and in turn, it has changed him. He says, after he's claiming that he wants to be with the woman he loves, quote, and all that I have just written about unanimity is unnecessary, entirely beside the point. I want to cross it out, tear it up, throw it away. He's still intent on recording the truth of life in the one state, but instead of emptily praising the world around him, he has turned his attention inward to record his own ever-changing emotions, which in and of themselves present a threat to the regulated order of the one state. A mere quarter of the way through the text, D503's narrative technique is in describing events, quote, only approximately, only by more or less, quote, close analogies, quote, end quote. And at times he completely abandons his logical prescribed structure in the interest of a passionate and confessional memoir. Instead of coming up with a topic, for instance, for his 11th entry, he simply gives up and just says, no, I cannot, I'll simply write without a plan. And so almost seamlessly, another discourse emerges, what Foucault might call a subjugated knowledge, one that privileges the rich inner life of an individual, of an I, rather than the homogeneity of the we. He says, I wanted to cross all this out because it is outside the outline topics for this entry. Then I decided I would leave it, let my notes, like the most sensitive seismograph, record the curve of even the most insignificant vibrations of my brain. He uses his journal to explore his own fragmented subjectivity, but also to acknowledge the way his identity is socially constructive, the way that various narratives merge, and the contingency of all composition. I'm going to move on. There's a lot more interesting things happening there, but I'm just going to move on to give one more example. Octavia Butler's The Parable series, which were published in the 1990s, which also foreground the act of writing. The first novel, Parable of the Sower, is similarly made up of a number of diary entries which are mixed with verses of our narrator, Lauren Olamina's religious and spiritual creation. She actually takes a writing about writing approach, meditating on the importance of writing in her life, and in communicating her ideas about Earthseed, which eventually formed the basis for a new way of communal living. She uses writing as a tool to achieve these things. Florence Journal is an outlet for her to voice her feelings, her thoughts, and her ideas, and a place that have no audience in her community or the larger world. She reveals her anxiety about writing, its purpose and its form, and its reception. At times, she believes that she is merely taking notes, but as we readers can see, she is not merely transcribing verses from some higher power, but powerfully melding her experiences and beliefs into Earthseed. As the novel progresses, Lauren's writing project takes on more significance. In fact, it has become a salvation to both her individually, but also to the community at large. She says, "I'm going to go through my old journals and gather the verses I've written into one volume. Then, someday, when people are able to pay more attention to what I say than how old I am, I'll use these verses to pry them loose from the rotting past and maybe push them into saving themselves and building a future that makes more sense." So in this way, in all of these novels, there's a foregrounded act of individual composition, but it connects to larger pathways of resistance. So we just saw in the Parable series how it connects to the formation of the Earthseed communities. In 1984, it's connected to sort of the resistance and the brotherhood. In The Handmaid's Tale, it's also connected to the May Day resistance. And in We, it is connected to the resistance that happens beyond the green world and the meth heap. So acts of writing and composition, revision, reading, and storytelling are viewed as dangerous to the ruling order, and they're suppressed at all costs. The protagonists construct narratives and open up spaces where they can express themselves, and in doing so, they create utopian landscapes within these otherwise dystopian spaces, perhaps an example of what Frederick Jameson calls a utopian enclave. They also, actually, I just want to say one other thing about the use of composition. There's actually a really interesting thing that I didn't get to talk about in detail here, but because the writers often do not have like-minded people, as I mentioned earlier, to communicate with, they actually posit and create audiences. This happens across all of the texts I've mentioned, and that act, that imaginative act of creating an audience, is also really integral to the role of writing and composing as a utopian project. Composing resistance, then, I hope, will be an essential intervention in utopian studies and science fiction, which have yet to engage with writing studies in any sustained way. The project includes an exploration of composing in classic dystopias, such as the ones I just discussed, but also moves to an exploration of digital writing, such as the coding and hacking of cyberpunk from the 1980s and 1990s, as well as the programming of lives in artificial intelligence, and even extends to other types of multimodal experimental composition, such as, for example, in the recently released textbook of Joan by Lydia Yuknovich, where she uses her body to actually create a composition. She actually burns and grafts onto her own body. So I'm interested in what these acts of writing and revision can offer an understanding of the imaginative power of science fiction text, and the fundamental work of utopianism, which is desiring otherwise, bridging the gap between is and ought, and to borrow Miguel Abensour's term, to educate desire. So composing resistance explores the role writing plays in these projects, and then also we'll look at how we can translate this understanding to real-world circumstances where we advocate for both writing as social change and science fiction as a critique and as a useful way of thinking about our real world. So thank you.